Hello, Finance and Governance Committee members. This is Jennifer Hiraoka, Senior Manager, Internal Controls, with an Accounting and Financial Reporting Risk Assessment Update. Our recommendation is that the Finance and Governance Committee receive the Risk Assessment Update regarding accounting and financial reporting as part of the Internal Controls Integrated Framework pursuant to the City of Oxnard Finance Policy 1.05 and recommend that staff forward the presentation to City Council. In December 2021, the City of Oxnard completed the adoption of the Internal Control Integrated Framework policies, which are aimed at strengthening and improving the city's overall control and operating environment. Policy 1.05, titled City Council's Risk Assessment Responsibilities, established that the City Council ensures that risk assessments are performed. The objective of this presentation is to communicate the preliminary results of the targeted risk assessment for fiscal year 22-23 and to present next steps. On the agenda, first, we'll review what a risk assessment is and why it's needed. Second, we'll present what was performed as part of the targeted risk assessment, including the targeted risk assessment objectives as they align to the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission Internal Control Framework, referred to as the COSO framework. Next, we'll present the targeted risk assessment preliminary results. And finally, we'll discuss next steps for the fiscal year 23-24 risk assessment. So let's refresh our memories and discuss what a risk assessment is and why it's needed. A risk assessment identifies and analyzes the risks facing the city as it seeks to achieve its objectives. This risk assessment provides the basis for prioritizing and developing appropriate internal controls to eliminate or reduce risks related to accounting and financial reporting. As I mentioned earlier, the city adopted a financial policy that the City Council ensures that risk assessments are performed. The city's annual audit for 2014-2015 produced an audit finding that two types of risk assessments need to be performed: a fraud risk assessment and an accounting and financial reporting risk assessment. In response to the finding, the city engaged consultants, Price Page & Company, to perform a fraud risk assessment and to perform detailed reviews of reporting and compliance risks of high priority areas. With the implementation of the new ERP system, it is important to maintain internal controls, especially those that were put in place as a result of a previous audit finding, which is why the framework and a plan for a targeted risk assessment, which is designed to focus on maintaining existing internal controls, was created. Let's go over the fiscal year 22-23 targeted risk assessment, planned versus actual. Our fiscal year 22-23 targeted risk assessment included reviewing the following processes that were implemented during the implementation, the ERP implementation: purchasing, accounts receivable for miscellaneous revenues and general billing, general ledger, and accounts payable. Areas which were originally planned for completion as part of the fiscal year 22-23 targeted risk assessment were postponed due to the ERP learning curve, system stabilization, and prioritization of other internal control priorities, and will instead be the focus of the fiscal year 23-24 targeted risk assessment. Those processes are grants, capital assets, vendor master maintenance, and purchasing cards. Establishing effective internal controls is a continuous process, which should follow the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, or COSO, framework for designing and managing internal controls. Utilization of the COSO framework for designing and managing internal controls is recommended by both the federal government as well as the California State Controller. The system of internal controls has been evaluated using this COSO framework. The 5 components of COSO internal control are control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring activities. The preliminary results of the targeted risk assessment are communicated according to their respective COSO component on the following slides. But before we discuss the preliminary results, let's briefly touch on each of the COSO components. As I mentioned earlier, establishing effective internal controls is a continuous process, which is depicted by the circular nature of this diagram, which starts at the top of the circle with the control environment. The control environment is the set of standards, processes, and structures that provide the basis for carrying out internal control and sets the tone across the organization. Next, the risk assessment allows management to identify the need for control and monitoring activities, improvements to the flow of information and communication, or the need for changes to the control environment. Control activities are established through policies and procedures or through controls embedded into the ERP system that help ensure that management's directives to mitigate risk, as documented in the risk assessment, are carried out. Coming around the bottom half of the circle is information and communication, which is a continual iterative process of providing, sharing, and obtaining necessary information to meet accounting and disclosure requirements under governmental accounting standards. Next, monitoring activities are the continuous evaluation of each of the COSO components to ensure they are functioning effectively, including this COSO monitoring activities component, to assess the execution and quality of established control activities. The next 2 slides contain highlights of the monitoring activities that were performed as part of this review. Now that we've laid the foundation of the COSO framework, let's discuss the FY 22-23 Targeted Risk Assessment preliminary results as they align to the COSO internal control framework. Below are selected highlights of either the internal control enhancements or areas of strength or areas of improvement opportunities that have been addressed or will be addressed in the future. Please note that these preliminary results are pending discussion with City Management. Starting at the top with the control environment, it has been noted that processes are in a stabilization period post-ERP implementation, and policies and procedures continue to be updated to reflect process changes. Next, for the risk assessment, it has been noted that risk assessments were prepared for the following targeted risk assessment areas: purchasing, accounts receivable for miscellaneous revenues, general billing, general ledger, and accounts payable to ensure that risks are managed and mitigated. Targeted risk assessments for grants, capital assets, vendor master maintenance, and purchasing cards will be performed in 2024 due to the ERP learning curve, system stabilization, and prioritization of other internal control priorities. For control activities, the areas of strength were that the ERP system has the following internal controls embedded into the system: segregation of duties, which is the system workflow separates the responsibilities for authorizing transactions and processing transactions, replacing the manual control of individuals, ensuring that they aren't the only authorizer and approver, or that the transaction is processed by people without conflicting responsibilities. Another area of strength is reviews and approvals. The system workflow automation ensures secondary reviews and supervisory approvals that transactions have been properly authorized, accurately recorded, and correctly reflect the events that have occurred, replacing the manual control of people routing reviews and approvals appropriately via a paper-based process and approvals being captured on paper. Next, the system has adequate, accurate, and readily available documents and records. The electronic management of transaction documents ensures that documents are centrally stored, that is, there is a single source of truth, they're accessible across the city for increased transparency, and that they are retained for the appropriate time frame. There are also internal controls embedded into the system for specific processes, such as, in purchasing, the ERP workflow captures approvals of requisitions. The ERP checks budget when entering a purchase requisition or contract, and the ERP limits purchasing transactions to pre-approved vendors. For the accounts receivable for miscellaneous revenues or general billing, the ERP ensures that pricing and application of payment to correct miscellaneous receivable general ledger by utilizing charge codes that are created into the system. For the general ledger, the ERP workflow captures approvals of journal entries, and the ERP generally limits users to general ledger accounts within their organizational unit. For accounts payable, the ERP workflow captures approvals of vendor invoices, and the ERP limits transactions to pre-approved vendors with the exception of one-time vendors which require periodic manual review. As we go around the COSO framework circle, the final two components are information and communication and monitoring activities. We'll start with the results of the monitoring activities, and then we'll come back to information and communication. Highlights of the results of the monitoring activities that were performed as part of this review are as follows. Areas of strength. For accounts payable, the ERP limits payments from general ledger accounts that have available budget, and the ERP records who views supporting documentation and attachments and when. This results in payments made within budget with supporting documentation and with proper authorization. The ERP workflow has been adjusted to require CFO approval of large payments, which are currently defined as single payments greater than $500,000. In purchasing, the ERP workflow captures approvals of requisitions. And in the accounts receivable general billing for miscellaneous revenues area, the ERP utilizes AR charge codes, which simplify the application of payment to correct receivable general and ensures accurate pricing. For the general ledger, the ERP workflow captures approvals of journal entries, and the ERP limits users to general ledger's accounts within their organizational unit. Opportunities for improvement and mitigation measures in process are as follows. Monitoring activities need to be formalized and documented separate from this evaluation of the system of internal controls. In the accounts receivable general billing for miscellaneous revenues area, the instances of bills not generated within 30 days of the service provided, and there were instances of receivables not being referred to collections timely. These improvement opportunities will be resolved by communicating the results of the targeted risk assessment with the appropriate parties. In the general ledger area, processes for account reconciliations are in a stabilization period post-ERP implementation. The ERP users are gaining familiarity with ERP reporting tools and ad hoc inquiries to efficiently access financial data stored in the ERP. And finally, in the accounts payable process, the following opportunities for improvement were identified and have already been resolved, which is why they don't appear on this slide. There were instances of invoices paid from incorrect expense accounts, and the ERP did not initially require the CFO review of large payments. But while the system workflow ensures secondary reviews and supervisor approvals, and CFO approval was required of the full list of payments, or the check run, the workflow initially did not include the CFO review and approval of large payments. Now on to the preliminary results for information and communication. Information and communication areas of strength are the ERP user quick guides that also incorporate relevant control activities are readily available to all ERP users. And ERP users completed ERP training prior to go live, and new users are expected to complete on-demand trainings post-go live. A mitigation measure is in process as the results of this targeted risk assessment and monitoring activities will be communicated to Council and to appropriate city staff to improve process efficiency or effectiveness. In summary, the implementation of the new ERP system, Tyler Munis, has enhanced the city's internal controls over financial reporting. The automatic routing of purchasing, accounts payable, general ledger, and miscellaneous accounts receivable transactions for the appropriate level of authorization, review, approval, and verification, replacing processes that were reliant on people to manually route paper-based or electronic transaction documents for approval, is one of the internal control enhancements. Additionally, internal controls that were initially put into place as a result of a previous audit finding were embedded into the system where appropriate. For example, prior audit finding 2015-098 required the purchasing department to maintain procedures to ensure that the spreadsheet containing the list of approved contracts is complete. With the implementation of the ERP system, maintaining a spreadsheet is not required, as a list of all approved contracts is an ERP-generated report. And finally, noted improvement opportunities did not constitute control failures due to either the exposures found are minor in extent and nature, or other compensating controls exist. We had planned to complete a full risk assessment for fiscal year 23-24, which would be compiling a list of all success for the entire city, but instead are pivoting to a targeted risk assessment for the following processes to ensure limited resources are focused on higher risk areas. The fiscal year 23-24 processes are grants, purchasing cards, vendor master maintenance, and capital assets. This concludes our presentation. We'll return to you in the fall of 2024 to report the fiscal year 23-24 targeted risk assessment results.